downfall of a dynasty, rise of the YNs.
Remember how happy you used to be. And now you're turning us up, yeah, I can't believe. Can't believe. Can't believe. Can't believe. Can't believe.
Back in the day, being a YN was unheard of. You would get violated, beat up, or killed. Secrecy keeps the gang alive like the mob. Today we will talk about the downfall of the Folks Nation. The Folks Nation was started by Larry Hoover, David Barksdale, and King Shorty. Others were involved, but those were the major players. They started with the Gangster Disciples and Black Disciples, which together were the Black Gangster Disciples. They had members branch off and form other gangs. The Latin Disciples and Satan Disciples were Latino gangs under the Folks Alliance, and the Satan Disciples were front lines, like infantry in the military. The Satan Disciples and Latin Disciples were great allies, doing everything together from partying to doing hits. Satan Disciple structure was maintained by the insane Gangster Disciple structure. Gangster Disciples were growth and development. Black Gangster Disciples were military. Insane Gangster Disciples were assassins. Imperial Gangsters were universal rank. Latin Disciples were Latin cousins. And Satan Disciples were fighting soldiers. The chief was called the King, and structure came down from there. King Canary and King Aggie were some of the first chiefs. Aggie was the more recent, and he was part of the reason for the downfall. He ran the mob very well, as for the most part, people feared the Satan Disciples as they should. But as time went by, Aggie got old, and they wanted a new chief. Aggie had a right-hand man named Gizmo. He was more favored for how close he was to the nation, and people questioned Aggie for use of gang funds. Gizmo was there for the mob and would drive to faraway hoods to provide aid and assistance to the Satan Disciples. He was also cool with the Latin Disciples. He was younger and more hip, so they elected him to be the new leader after Aggie went to jail. When Aggie came out of jail, he expected to be welcomed with open arms, but he was met with a mutiny. This angered him, and he is suspected of putting a hit out on Gizmo, who was gunned down in an alley while waiting to meet with Aggie. After this, Aggie went into hiding after being suspected of killing Gizmo. This splintered the nation and gave rise to lawlessness. Out of this came many killings inside the Satan Disciples, and a war with the Latin Disciples, which had been the greatest ally of the Satan Disciples, weakening their force in the street. Now, being at war with almost every gang in the city and having no real leader, the Satan Disciples became more disorganized. A few tried to rise up and lead, but failed. The twins who worked for the cartel turned informants. Few went to jail. Bobby D tried to bring structure but was killed while trying to hand out a violation to a younger member. The Satan Disciples branched out to suburbs such as Rockford and Waukegan. The Waukegan chapter was started by a legendary Satan Disciple named Thug Life. Another was started by other members who moved to Waukegan, and a renegade gang called the Renegade Disciples, which were former Satan Disciples, moved to Waukegan, as well as the Latin Disciples and Folks Alliance enemies, the Latin Kings, and insane unknowns, as well as folk rivals, Latin Lovers, City Knights, Insane Cobras, and Orchestra Albany, or OAs.
And throughout all the structure, the SDs basically really branched out and moved up north. There was a lot of love back in them days, because Thug Life, along with some other members, they formed the 18th and Park, And before them, they had already formed the Yeoman Park SDs in Waukegan. They maintained a lot of structure, but eventually it all starts to fall apart. You know, this whole video is like on the old ways of these gangs, the old structures. When the leaders start dying, there's no more structure left. There's nobody to guide these kids. So what happened in 18th and Park is they made the set, there was real members there, but they just didn't have enough OGs to keep the set open, so they decided to close it. And everybody basically, you're either renegade or you went to Yeoman Park. So that's what happened there. But in Yeoman Park, they were mass recruiting so much, they were recruiting a lot of informants, a lot of kids that just were not down for these sentences. Like, you could go around and unalive people all you want, you could do all these things, but you got to do the time. You could go sell Diet Coke all you want, but you got to do the time. You could whip someone all you want, but if they come back looking for revenge, you got to do the time. And that's the problem. The problem is it was gone with all these old ones, all these old heads. They stuck to the code, they stuck to the rules. That's what kept together, like the American mob. But now you have no structure. That's what was the birth of the YNs. The birth of the YNs was the death of the structure of the gangs. The whole reason for it, to make money. Now you got Vaughn off 1700, you got King Vaughn. None of them talk about making no money. All they talk about is sliding, drilling. It's not what a gang is about. A gang is about progression through poverty. You need to be on the corner with the Diet Coke. You need to be working a job. You need to open a business for people. That's what these gangs were about. The beef, of course, there was beef, but beef was over drug territory. Beef was not just, oh, let's just go out and slide because we want to. The gang leaders looked down on that, and that's why a lot of them were unpopular and got taken out, because the YNs wanted to come in and mess stuff up. But that's eventually what took down the SDs in Waukegan was the rats. What took down the SDs in Chicago, I mean, they're still there, but they're losing a lot of members because of that revenge. You could go out and unalive all you want. You could talk junk on the internet, but when the revenge comes, you gotta be ready. You can't be just sitting there thinking you're King Tut and the ops ain't on nothing, and they pull up and let off a whole switch, a whole 50 on you. What are you gonna do? Now you're on a t-shirt, But I'm gonna get into the maniacs too, because they played a big role in Waukegan, and they played a big role in the birth of the YNs. Not as much as like the black gangs, but I'm not really gonna discuss them in this part. I'm just sticking to the Latinos because they had so much structure. I just put some images of the black gangs because that's where it all started from. You gotta go back to the origins. That was the original structure. But they're a whole mess over there. So we have, there was Albert, the original Prince, and then you have, Prince Rick Dog. That was the maniacs, and they got along with the SDs very good. Brought them into the nation, gave them their shield, all of this, and swore really protection for them, acceptance. Even though they were Latinos, they were accepted, you know, and it was going good. Prince Rick Dog had the nation, they were making their money, they were doing their stuff, they were on the news, all type of things, but the good things fall apart. Eventually, like Local D and all of them, they just wanted so much war, and I think Prince Rick Dog was more focused on like money. He was kind of like Johnny Torrio, but like not exactly the same because Torrio was kind of in his ways. He didn't want like all the hot stuff to be
Well, I don't know,
associated with
Jimmy.
the
You think I
mob.
would take chances like
And
Jenny?
Tommy, he's a good kid too, but he's crazy. He's a cowboy. He's got too much to prove.
No, I know.
You gotta watch out for kids like this.
Yeah, I know.
You know, a lot of old school mobsters didn't because it brought police attention. They didn't want that because they're already making millions. Why do we want you selling drugs and all of this other stuff? Now you're gonna have the police scratching on us, the feds, the DEA. Not only that, but when you get caught for this big drug case, now you're more likely to rap.
I don't want any more of that shit.
What shit? What are you talking about?
Just stay away from the garbage, you know what I mean?
That just brings a liability. And I think that was the liability that Prince Rick Dog seen with these people. They wanted to unalive everybody, and they wanted these big beefs with like the Cobras and all these other gangs, and it just really tore the gang apart until the bums came along and they eventually wanted to overthrow everyone in power. And eventually they took out Prince Rick Dog. And I think when he left, that was the end of the real maniacs. After that, it just became issues, like they moved up north, which I think the maniacs up north, they're a lot more structured than kind of in the city, because in the city it's just a free for all. Like, imagine you're trying to make money and you're just beefing with every other gang. Like, them dudes beef with every gang. The SDs in the city are at war with every gang. Their only really ally was each other. But that came to an end, you know? Disputes, fighting, people got unalived. It really brought problems because it's always some drunk dude from the maniacs or the SDs, and he gets drunk and he goes and unalives one of the other ones. Now, what do you have? You know, you got issues, problems. But I mean that's just the way it is, and it's sad, but that's what causes these problems. That's what gave birth to the YNs, and it's a real sad truth. But when they came up here, they made South Park and Waters. That's the only set I know of. I don't. It's in Waukegan. It's not too far from the SD set, from the King set on A Street. You know, you got the Insane Unknowns over there. You had the City Nights, but they're not as prevalent anymore. But they got along with the SDs because the SDs and the Maniacs in Chicago, they fell out over drug turf a while ago, and they're at war. They're attacking each other, and it really made them weaker. It made the dynasty weaker because now your only ally, they're basically the same gang. There's not one wears yellow and one wears baby blue. Like, there's not much of a difference. But now you're weakened. Now the Latin Kings could come from this angle. The Unknowns could come from this angle. All these other gangs can come, the Cobras, etc. Because you weaken your force. You let outside temptations ruin it. It's the same thing with the BDs and the GDs. They let outside forces ruin what they had good. And it was very good. They were dominant. They were dominating the drug turf. But you kind of lose interest. It's divide and conquer. That's what they taught us. Divide and conquer. And that's really what it was. And that led to the death of the dynasty. You know, back in the day when I was a kid, the Maniacs, they didn't have much rats. They had a bunch of gunners. Nowadays, it's just not like that. They got a bunch of rats. It's just like the SDs. It's falling apart, and that leads to the ability for them to get picked off. It's sad. It's sad it had to be like that. If you like this video, please like and subscribe. Give me a comment. Let me know what I could do better. I try to go into detail in these videos because not a lot of people do. They always cover King Von and all these little kids. Like, well, people don't really get an idea of where this came from and that it wasn't always nonsense. But thank you.